about the decline of the middle class, it's important to understand that since 2001, we have lost in this country over 60,000 factories and millions of decent paying jobs. Now the young people literally, when they go shopping, and they buy products made in China or Vietnam or wherever, they literally do not know that there was once a time, not so many decades ago, that in the United States we produced much of what we purchased. Corporations, multinational corporations, as a result of disastrous trade policies, and by that I mean NAFTA and CAFTA and permanent normal trade relations with China. And I'll never forget that, and Dennis will remember it as well, because we were in Congress at the time. You had the agenda of corporate America putting pressure on the president, putting pressure on the Congress, and their argument is, think of what happens, all of the products that we're going to be selling to Mexico, and later on all the products we're going to be selling to China. Nobody who had any sense believed it then, and certainly we don't believe it now. As a result of these disastrous trade policies, millions of American workers have been thrown out on the streets of America. If you want to know about the American economy and what's happened over the last 30 years, know this. 30 or so years ago, the largest private sector employer in the United States was General Motors. General Motors made a real product. It had a strong union, the UAW. It paid good wages and had very good benefits. That was 30 years ago. Today, the largest private sector employer in America is Walmart, which pays starvation wages, is vehemently anti-union, and has almost no benefits at all. That is the transition of the American economy. In terms of education, now everybody here understands that we are in a highly competitive global economy, and we need to have the best educated workforce. But more importantly, we understand that education and learning and intellect and intellectual activity is what being human is about. It's an important part of what being human is about. And I would hope that every person in this room understands that it is imperative that every person in this country who has the desire and the ability gets the education they need regardless of the income of their family. Now here's the sad news. Here is the sad news. Today, 30 years ago, we led the world in terms of the percentage of our people who graduated college. We were number 1. Today, we are number 12. And what that means is there are hundreds of thousands of bright, young people who have so much to offer, who look at the cost of college today, who look at the kind of debt they're going to leave school with, and they say, no thanks, it's not worth it. And then you've got millions of other people who in fact do go to college and they leave school or graduate school deeply in debt. And that debt hangs around their shoulders for decades. A few months ago, I met a woman who was not only paying off her debt from college, she was paying off her kids' debt from college. All right, it goes on and on. Now, what sense does it make in a competitive global economy to discourage and make it hard for people to get the education that they need? What we have got to do is, instead of investing more and more in the military, what we have got to do is say tuition. Here's the irony. In your great state of California, I don't know how many of you remember that,
But
30, 40 years ago, what was the tuition at the University of California, one of the great universities? Well, it was hard. It was either $200 or zero. But it was a hell of a lot less than it is today. The great City College of New York, one of the great colleges in America, tuition was zero. So where have we gone in 40 years? We've gone in exactly the wrong direction. I will be very shortly introducing legislation which will make tuition free for every public college and university. What's happening to the middle class of this country. And all of that would be understandable if, for example, some terrible tragedy befell America and everybody suffered. There was some terrible natural disaster. You know, there are tornadoes that strike a town and it leaves a path of pain and horror. But I think what makes the American people today so angry and so frustrated is that the economic crisis that they are experiencing is certainly not universal. The fact of the matter is that while tens of millions of American families are struggling to put bread on the table, while millions of families are one paycheck away from disaster. I mean, I have talked to people if their car broke down and they didn't get to work and they got fired from their job, their entire family would financially collapse. Talk to people who are one divorce away from disaster, one illness away from disaster, one automobile accident. People are just hanging on. And if one part of the picture ends up badly, they collapse. They lose their jobs, they lose their income, and God knows where they will be. But in the midst of that suffering and that anxiety, there is another reality in America that needs to be talked about a whole lot. And that is that our country today has, by far, not even close, the most unequal distribution of wealth and income of any major economy on earth. And that gap between the very, very rich and everyone else is growing wider. Now, I'm going to bore you for a moment with some statistics. My wife says, don't do it, don't do it. The hell with it. I'm going to do it. There you go. And you got all this stuff. If you fall asleep now, it's on my website, Sanders. I'm going to go through it. But here it is. Today in America, the top 1% owns about 42% of the financial wealth of America. Okay? 1% owns 42%. When I talk to kids, I say, look at that big pizza. It's 100 slices of pizza, and one pretty chubby guy gets 42 slices. But this is a very sophisticated audience, so I like it. And then, if you look at the pizza, you find that the bottom 60% own about 1.7% of the wealth. So you got less than two people. The bottom 60% owns less than 2%, top 1% owns 42%. So you got two people, you got 60 people sharing 2% of the pizza. Two pieces. It's pizza analogy is very good. Now here's something else. Listen to this one. Forget the pizzas, but listen to this. Today, the top 1/10 of 1%, 1/10 of 1%, own almost as much wealth as the bottom 90% of the American people. Got that? 1/10 of 1% versus 90%. Today, one family, the Walton family that owns Walmart, that one family owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. Over the past 40 years, we have witnessed an enormous transfer of wealth. You know, our friends on the right say, this redistribution of wealth, it's a communist idea, it's a terrible idea. In fact, we have seen over the last 40 years a massive redistribution of wealth in this country. The only problem is it has gone in the wrong direction. And here's another boring statistic, but it's important. Between 1985 and 2013, the bottom 90% lost almost $11 trillion in wealth that it otherwise would have had if the distribution of wealth had remained at the same level as it was in 1985. Bottom 90% lost almost $11 trillion, $10.8 trillion. Meanwhile, the top 1/10 of 1% experienced an $8 trillion increase in wealth as the distribution of wealth became increasingly unequal. So what you've seen is a massive transfer of wealth from the middle class, not even to the top 1%, but to the top 1/10 of 1%. And we just discovered this fact, and I was just using it on the floor of the Senate the other day. Just listen to this one, and just to show you, I mean, it's just almost hard to imagine how grotesque this situation is. Between 2013 and 2015, in a 2-year period, the wealthiest 14 people in America, I'm not talking about 14%, 14 people, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Koch brothers and others, 14 people saw a $157 billion increase in their wealth in 2 years. That increase in wealth is more wealth than is owned by the bottom 40% of the American people. What these guys made in a 2-year period. That's where we're at. In terms of income, income is what we make in a given year as opposed to wealth, which is what we accumulate in our lifetime. The latest information that we have is that since the Wall Street crash of 2008, 99% of all new income is going to the top 1%. During that period, the top 1% earned more income than the bottom 50%. In other words, while millions and millions of Americans have seen a decline in their family income, while there has been a significant increase in senior poverty, and we have elderly people throughout this country, and it's unbelievable. You know, I'm on a committee that deals with this stuff. You've got senior citizens out there whose sole income is Social Security. It may be $10,000 a year, $12,000 a year. These are people who are literally making the choice about whether they eat properly, whether they heat their homes, whether they buy the drugs that they need. While all of that is going on for seniors, 99% of all new income is going to the top 1%. Last year, the top 25 hedge fund managers made more than $24 billion. Enough to pay the full salaries of more than 425,000 public school teachers. Today, corporate profits are at an all-time high, and CEOs earn about 270 times more than their average employees. And on it goes. In terms of taxation, today corporate America is paying about 11% of our federal revenues. In 1952, they paid over 30%. In any given year, you have major corporations like General Electric, Verizon, paying zero in federal income tax because of all the loopholes they benefit from. Every single year, we are losing at least $100 billion because corporate America and the wealthy stash their profits in the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and other tax havens in order to avoid paying taxes in America. Now that is just a very broad overview of what's going on in the American economy. Bottom line is, middle class is shrinking. We have an incredible number of people in poverty. We have high unemployment. And while all of that is going on, there is a grotesque level of income and wealth inequality. Almost all no income is going to the people who need it the least. Now, what do we have to do from a public policy point of view and from a political point of view? What is our job now? Well, one of our critical jobs right now is to come up with a progressive agenda that makes sense to the American people, because it addresses the real issues facing the American people.